while we get sort of everything set up, I'll just say hello again and thank Cosmo for setting this up, and thank you all for coming. I hope this will be sort of interesting and productive for all of you, even if particular subject matter that I've used ThinkSpace to introduce students to is somewhat different. The tools, as I've discovered myself, can be very powerful ones and can be sort of useful for, I would think, getting students, particularly in an online environment, particularly when you're dealing with a larger group of them, to do the kind of harder, deeper kind of analytical work that is so often something that we want. So I hope this didn't take too long, but I teach stories, so let me tell you a story. About 2 years ago, I started work on moving Classical Studies 273, that is our Greek and Roman mythology class, into an online format for the first time here at ISU. Anyway. And this was my first time teaching online. We had high hopes that have been realized so far, that being a class that was well enrolled, but here in the early planning stages, I could already foresee particular areas of difficulty. And the strongest one, or what seemed to be the scariest one, dealt with the subject of how to get teaching about the interpretation of mythology into this high class, this high enrollment online format. Myths are fun, certainly, but studying mythology should be about more than just learning all the fun stories that the crazy Greeks thought were true. And so, in particular, the approach that I've always taken in presenting the material puts a great deal of emphasis on introducing students to methods for the interpretation of mythology. That is, not simply getting a mastery of the kind of basic content of stories, but being able to push down to the deeper level of where the stories come from, what are the stories. Now, in a face-to-face format, which I also teach the class face-to-face, usually in relatively small enrollment sections. The way that we approach this problem is using tools that are familiar from any sort of involved analytical process teaching. So we give them a lot of practice. They get a lot of sort of direct guidance from me, from the professor, both sort of initially and then in the form of comments back on their practice. They do it a lot. They write a lot. And I was concerned as I was envisioning how to sort of create this kind of experience for the students in the online format. How could we introduce students to these same sorts of skills in a format where there's going to be many of them, in a format where we're never in the same room, whether literally or virtually at the same time. And so when Ritu and I first sat down in the late fall of 2015, this was really sort of the first question in my mind is there a way in which that we can get students to learn to do this kind of analysis that would work in the online format and that would not require me to do more grading than was humanly possible and collapse dead the first time that I offered it. And so it was really Ritu, who was the one who had familiarity to it first, who told me about the possibilities of ThinkSpace. So anything you want to say about that?
Maybe just that I just matched the tool with the right person. So when we first started talking about it, I think there were a lot of things new. First of all, it was new online formats. He had never taught online before. That was one thing that was in the back of my mind. I didn't want to overwhelm him with a lot of options and resources and things like that. We talked about the content, and there were a lot of readings and a lot of content that the course covers. That was another aspect of how do we put everything online. And that too, it was a summer course, right? And we had about 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8-week course. So from a 16-week full face-to-face class, we were moving to an 8-week summer course format. That doesn't mean that the intensity will come down, but still there has to be things that have to be like the must-haves have to be there. So and then he had this huge thing about grading, because all the papers, there were a lot of submissions, a lot of written assignments that Dr. Hall would have to grade. And another consideration was the scores. Whatever we design, the design needs to scale up. It can start with a class of 30, and maybe in the following semester it would go up to a class of 70 or 80. So it has to be scaled. So considering all of those things, when we started talking, we said that this is the kind of assignment that I do and how I analyze this approach. That's the time I'm talking about going in a sequential manner. So that's the thing that I thought about ThinkSpace. My introduction to ThinkSpace was problem-based approach, where you can solve the problem in a sequential manner, in a sequential and explorative. I can use that word, because students are learning as well as they are going about doing the different steps in that process. So I thought that would be a nice match, and it turned out to be a great fit for
And certainly there was a sort of whole process that I remember from our early conversations talking about. I remember quite starkly you telling me that given the sort of time frame, given the online format, you can either have them read a lot or have them do a lot, but not both.
Yes. So exactly, and we typically use that for designing online. That's what my approach was. First, I would tell him that make sure your outcomes are concrete, and then we can go from there. It cannot be right. You cannot have what you want to teach before the outcome. So that's how we kind of streamlined what was absolutely essential that the students have to take away from the class, and then what they need for that to accomplish. So that's how I think streamlined a lot of those content.
Yeah, and certainly I am pleased with the way that though it is a summer course, though it is online, they read less than the students who take the full 16-week version, in the sense they read fewer pages, read fewer myths. But I would stand by the sort of general breadth they get of the subject area, and also by the sort of depth of learning that they are getting. What we ended up doing was designing a course so that basically every week we did one story, chose the stories to be of a reasonable length, chose a variety of stories that would cover all the sort of the greatest hits of Greek mythology. They'd read the story, they would have a multiple choice quiz administered through Blackboard that would cover sort of the essentials of the story and its background. They would do some discussion in an online forum about the content of the story amongst themselves and with me as well. And sort of most interesting for us today, they would every week do an interpretive activity that would be hosted on ThinkSpace. What sort of pleased me most about or what sort of the thing that attracted my attention most, and the tool that we ended up incorporating into the ThinkSpace activities that we designed, was the opportunity for the students to be walked through this interpretation as a process. Now, of course, a humanistic analysis, literary analysis, mythological analysis is similar. It is like and different from types of analysis that you would see in mathematics, that you would see in the hard sciences, but it's still following a series of processes. And so what sort of first grabbed my interest thinking about ThinkSpace was this possibility of, rather than just laying out for students, here's a method of interpretation, here's a story, interpret the story using the method, to instead create these sorts of the activities in ThinkSpace that would actually break down that analysis into, best I could, specific concrete steps. Here's the question, here's the story, and in each step, write your particular responses, and then those responses will be carried forward to the next phase, and you can then use the sort of fruits of each phase to build up ever more sort of complex, ever more complete analyses, eventually finishing up with a very short sort of writing assignment of, if you have to summarize what the analysis that you've just done. So apart from the sort of the step-by-step process where the students get to sort of plug in the values and keep them, the other feature that I like the sound of, and that has turned out to be, just based on the feedback we get from the students, a very powerful one, is the opportunity for the students to get sort of step-by-step feedback on the process. And that, in the assignments that we design, come in basically two forms. One is that as part of sort of the intermediate steps of each ThinkSpace case, students have an opportunity to see basically, how did I answer the questions they just answered? They can look at their answers as they fill them in, and then a much longer, much more detailed version that I've created. And then, crucially, I ask them the question: How are your responses similar? How are your responses different from what the expert said? And depending on the particular form of analysis they're using, different doesn't necessarily mean wrong, which is a comment that I repeated many times in the other part, which was I would then read them and I would provide as best I could, given the scale and time frame, individual feedback about things they could work on for their next analysis. There were a number of different methods of interpretation we had students use. There are three that I like to hit upon. So in the course of an 8-week summer course, try to do basically one method of interpretation for 2 weeks. So that is 2 different ThinkSpace activities using the same basic structure, but applied to 2 different stories. They would increase in complexity in the course of the course as students got more familiar both with sort of the essentials of myth interpretation and the essentials of the ThinkSpace tool, and they would all sort of build up to a final culminating writing assignment where this didn't happen in ThinkSpace. It was just a paper they would write, but that I told them that they received guidance throughout of go directly back to the ThinkSpace writing that you've been doing, because that will provide you with building blocks. It will provide you with text in some cases that you can use to incorporate into this final paper, but which is otherwise a place where you're largely working without a net. Here's a story. Choose the method of interpretation that you want to use and apply it. You will have learned how to do this by now. So show me what you can do on your own. And can we show one to them? You said you had it pulled up on a tab. So well, I mean, and we met very early on in the spring, and it was sort of, things were still in the course of this, for me, very excruciating process of paring things down to what was essential. And Ritu had told me that there are a lot of things you can do in ThinkSpace. It's very customizable, and so I still wasn't quite sure just what it was that I was going to want.
I'm glad that he trusted me and we went for it.
And so she said, let's go talk to Kajal. Kajal can tell you more about these tools. Yeah. And it was helpful to see the tools because that helped to sort of finally start to give some shape and some body to just what it was that I could be asking the students. I actually found for myself, just going through the course of designing the cases with Ritu, it was sort of helpful not just for itself, but for sort of forcing me to break this down into these, as best I could, the smallest possible concrete steps. Because being accustomed to doing this kind of analysis at the level that I'm doing it, there are 15 things going on at the same time in my mind as I'm reading one of these and doing one of these analyses. And so to sort of put myself in the mindset of, okay, what are the steps? What's the order of the steps? Was an incredibly helpful exercise that has borne a lot of fruit, both very physical fruit in the form of the ThinkSpace activities themselves, but it's changed the way that I structure and that I teach these approaches in my face-to-face classes. So here is, and I hope we'll be able to show you as much as we can. This is the week 4 case In the second module of the course, I try to choose as middle of the road an approach as I could. I have students do structuralist analyses of myths. This is, again, of the ones they learn, middle of the road in terms of sort of depth, middle of the road in terms of complexity. It's a step up from what they do in the first 2 weeks, but it's not quite as complicated as what they're going to do at the end. What a reader needs to do in a structuralist analysis is to break a story down into the smallest constituent parts. And so list the characters, list the places where things take place, list the events. And then once you've got that sort of bullet pointed list, sort it into, in a true structuralist analysis, it can be a huge number of sublists. But I ask students to just do 3. And those should correspond to some pair of opposites. So night and day, or life and death, or male and female. And then for the third group, something that brings these opposites into balance. This is, it's a fairly good standard 20th century form of myth interpretation, but not the easiest one to do. So, as a first step, ask the students to, first of all, condense the story into basic bullet points. And they get lectures about this, and lecture to watch. There's a Love the Resources tab, includes a link to an article that walks them through, a sort of scholarly one, and also some basic definitions of, here's what I mean when I say basic, the basic parts of the story. Here's what I mean when I mean an opposition, what I mean by mediation, and so forth. They can refer to those whenever they want. I wish they referred to them more often, but we all wish that. In step 2, they should look at that list and say, okay, put them into groups of like with like. And then once you've got the groups, and that can be sort of very kind of subjective. Once you've got the groups, name the groups. Again, with the idea that you should be ending up with 2 pairs of opposites and something that's in between. And then finally, to sum up, ask them in a paragraph, sort of try to give a prose summary of what you've just done. And that's all just in the first step. So, can I type? I don't know. Hopefully that will let us through to the next phase.
You could just move to the next phase, but then
okay.
You can
it might be locked, but it might be locked if I don't actually submit something. But let's see what we've got.
No, you can't submit it, but you can move from the top. That arrow button.
Okay.
Right. But it's great to see the show carry forward. So there are a lot of people who haven't seen ThinkSpace before. So you saw the inputs that he put into the boxes, and that has been pulled forward into the expert phase for comparison with an expert response. And that is basically carry forward.
Because then, as we talked about in the introduction, they get the sort of the fully broken down version that I create, which is, as I warn them, since they often say in the response of how was your response different, is oftentimes students will say, this is way more complicated than anything that I could have done. And I have a saved in my comment library. That's okay. It's supposed to be. But just to give them a sense of what, if they're totally on the wrong track, or just sort of, again, to the peek inside the expert's mind that is or can be so useful. Like I said.
And it's that immediate response to
yeah.
not having to wait till the next day when you've kind of forgotten about what you just put down.
Right. They can get the while it is still fresh in their mind, they can incorporate what might have been. Like I said, I've got some ideas of things to do for next summer based on feedback I've gotten so far. And then as a sort of final step, ask them to go through the basics of the process, but with the story that's going to be the story for their final project, which is also the story that they read in week 1. This is where I told them to come back to ThinkSpace as they're writing their final projects, because they're not just doing the analysis, they're also analyzing the analysis. Was this effective or not? Was it useful or not? And so in these last questions,
Yeah.
ask them to sort of address that question quite directly. What do you know? Don't do the whole analysis now, but start to think about how would you do this analysis to this other story that you're going to be asked to analyze later. And crucially for me, would you think this would be the right way to do it? Because part of that final project is choose what you think is going to be the most effective method for interpreting this story. Any of them, you're open to use any of them, but you should think critically about which one is going to be most effective.
So does that have one answer, that there is one method which will best suit the, or you could use any one and it doesn't matter as long as you do it well?
Well, it really depends on the story. It depends on the story and it depends on the method. And so, I mean, one of the things that is maybe unusual about me and my approach to teaching interpretation is that I am not a dogmatist. I am not a structuralist or a psychoanalyst or a charter anthropologist. I don't feel that there is one answer to the question of this is the best method in all cases. Its account of where myths come from is always true. But what I found and what I try to sort of impress on the students is that any of these methods can provide you with useful and interesting insights about the story. Some will work better with some stories, others with others. For the final project, I always try and choose a myth where you can get a productive interpretation from any of them. So I hope that there's not a right answer. There is for the individual students, and I sort of insist that they make the judgment call, choose the one that is best. But the sort of little secret that I keep from them is they're all good. They're all good in different ways, but it's still worthwhile to think about how do they work? How do they work differently? What works best for you? But that's just one of those ways in which humanistic analysis may be going to be a little bit different than some of the other sorts of things.
So is it important the rationale that they use as to why?
It is important the rationale that they use. In large part just because that will communicate to me how well they've understood what it is that these tools can tell them about a given story. In some ways, what's most interesting, I mean, I think many of them, in terms of what they choose as the most useful method, choose the one that they like the most. And they tend to like the one they understand the best. And which one they understand the best varies from student to student. What's in some ways more interesting to me are the ones that they choose not to use. Because I ask them to get into that rationale as well. Why didn't you use this method? Why wasn't it useful? Because that often touches very substantively on the method of interpretation they understand and the story they understand it. Because, like I said, different methods will work with varying degrees of success with different stories. And so if they say one of the other ones that, well, I mean, even for sort of structuralism, looking at pairs of opposites, they can say there's oppositions here, certainly. But if we focus on those, we are missing this key section of the story. This key section of the story is swept under the rug if we're focusing on trying to reconcile opposites. And that's, if they tell me that as a reason for choosing something else, that's great, because it means they've really understood something about what's important in the story. They've really understood how the method is supposed to be.
And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways even I found a long time ago in my students, that they would always insist on what is the right answer. And they say, there is no right answer, it's only your answer.
Yeah.
How well do you support it?
Or there are many right answers. Stories are complicated. People are complicated. Our responses to them are going to be understandably varied. Not to say, and if this sounds packed, because I was just having this conversation with my face-to-face myth students an hour ago, it's not true that it's just entirely how you feel, just entirely up to you. There's a method to this. And it's not true that you can take any story and analyze it any way you want to. But any given story is likely to have multiple layers of meaning, multiple productive ways of analyzing it. And so what I want them to take away is a familiarity with a variety of these tools. And a sense of the fact that these tools are, again, not just sort of they can say whatever they want, but there is a method to follow. There are specific ways to get at meaning. Not so that one of them is right, many of them are going to be right at the same time, but there's still rigor, there's still importance. So in terms of the outcomes, well, should have put in a slide about me. I am and I remain very pleased with the results that having students go through ThinkSpace activities produces. Not just in terms of what they're actually producing in ThinkSpace, but in terms of the quality of the final papers that they are able to produce. Where, again, telling them this is your ThinkSpace is not going to translate immediately into writing this paper, but the work you're doing there, sometimes quite directly in the form of writing that you're doing there, is something that you can use. I'm pleased with the depth of analysis they're able to produce, despite the fact they don't have 16 weeks to practice, despite the fact they don't have me breathing physically down their neck as they do these things. From the kind of writing that they are writing, I am confident that most of them, as many of them as get it in the face-to-face sections, are getting it online. And that's the thing that I wanted most of all. And many of them feel the same way. So lots of the responses we gave them some surveys this summer, sort of to try to evaluate their understanding of and their evaluation of all the various parts of the course, including ThinkSpace. Responses about the course and about ThinkSpace specifically are generally fairly positive. Would have liked it if there had been more. One student commented. Sometimes it was complicated because of the theories that we had to use. Oftentimes it made us work and analyze very hard. But in general, students felt like, particularly the comments, and particularly getting to see the expert responses, is providing them with more in-depth explanation of the interpretive styles that I want to get at. That being said, there are sort of areas for improvement, particularly in the first year. We did have some issues with software, and so there was an issue where sometimes students would complete the assignment and I couldn't see what they wrote. Sometimes I would give them comments and they couldn't see them. There was a whole complicated thing with due dates, and after the due date closed, students couldn't get back in and see the comments. Of course, I couldn't grade it until after the due date, and they'd all finished it. That's mostly been resolved. So complaints about software stability itself went down considerably from the first offering and second offering, which was good. Something that or two sort of areas of recurrent concern in terms of design were a number of students in both the first and second offering indicated that they didn't quite understand how the ThinkSpace activities in particular fit into the overarching plan of the course. They did them and they understood how to use the tools, but they didn't understand as well as I would have hoped why this was something that I was asking them to do. Besides that, a number of them just sort of, and this was not about ThinkSpace, just about sort of approaches themselves, found themselves a little bit swamped by the complexity of the analyses themselves. They said we weren't sure. Once we read the expert responses, we were pretty okay, but we often weren't sure on that first phase what it was that we ought to be entering into these various fields. Which again is not a ThinkSpace problem, it's a design problem, and so I am already hard at work thinking of ways to both incorporate make it clearer in terms of the larger construction of the course why they're doing what they're doing in ThinkSpace, and to perhaps break things down into even simpler sub-steps to get a better sense of how A leads to B leads ultimately to B. Teaching, like all things, complicated process and working. I've been talking a lot.
So would the students have done this kind of analysis and interpretation in a different course in a different way, or is this the first time they're doing it? So what I'm thinking is, would they have a comparative standard by, how this is different from if we were just given to interpret?
For most of them, they're likely to have some sort of general understanding of the method of interpretation. They just heard of it. But by and large, the sort of depth and the intensity of it that I ask of the Myth students is not some of their most encountered. I mean, and partly this is because classics is slightly old-fashioned discipline, so we are only just now getting around to things that were very in vogue in English and anthropology and so forth 60 years ago. But partly it's just a matter of, for a lot of these students, they're not English majors. They're not comparative literature majors. They're not literature majors of any kind. They're majoring in things. And so this might be the only sort of really intense literature course of any kind they take in the course of their college career. So it probably also feeds into their sort of confusion of, I'm not sure how to answer the question you're asking me, because no one else is asking you these types of questions.
We actually have one of the questions answered. If you would have, what would you have liked? Something. Would you have liked to use any other format for doing things?
So what's the response?
I don't remember off the top of my head what was the response, but we had mixed. Like, I think this semester, I would say more people were inclined to use ThinkSpace, and they thought it added value to learning the content than it was last year. Last year they were like, this year more on 60-40 kind of ratio.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But talking about the student background, it's pretty interesting because I've seen in the introduction forum. so we've had like students from all disciplines. I've seen even there was an engineering person or somebody from engineering.
Oh, I mean, just this last year, I think there were a half a dozen aerospace engineers.
Yes, exactly. So it's been from all across disciplines. That's pretty interesting to see the kind of student population that comes into the course.
It's one of the reasons that we were sort of so eager to create an online version of the course. This is classical mythology is a very popular course on campus with students of all majors. We have 2 face-to-face sections. One is 200, one is 35. They're both always full. The larger lecture section used to be 400, and it was always full. And so the impression we have is that regardless of sort of where they're coming from, why they're at ISU in general, this is a course that a lot of people with a broad variety of experiences are interested in. So we wanted to provide more opportunities for them to get exposed to the material. But that does also pose challenges of, for most of them, this is the only course like this they have taken all will ever take. So sort of getting them oriented is part of the challenge.
So has things kept in that aspect?
Yes, it has. Yes, it absolutely has, and that was something else that I should have mentioned. The other ThinkSpace feature that I really that intrigued me, that I really liked, of course, that first presentation was the comment library. One of the issues that particularly concerned me was not just, of course, the students' experience in the course, but my own, and I wanted them to be able to get meaningful feedback, because that's an important part of learning how to master any process. But I was concerned, especially because in the first year, the first offering was 35 students. This last year it was 70, hoping it would go up to 100 sometime in the next few offerings. Was how am I going to be able to provide meaningful comments to a class this size and also sleep sometimes? And so I was very excited when you told me, well, one of the features that's built right into ThinkSpace is not just providing sort of phase-by-phase comments, but a comment library. So if there are particular comments that you give frequently, and as any of you who have graded papers or have taught any sort of process learning, the same problems recur from student to student. One of the advantages of being face-to-face is one person raising their hand asks the question, you've answered it for all of them. Well, it can happen online, but with a comment library, if there is something that I find myself saying again and again, he doesn't always need moral, especially not in structuralism and so forth, then I can save it, and as I read through each student's particular responses, if I find myself needing to do the same comment again, I can do that. I can have it all saved there rather than having to type it out and reinvent it each time. And that has saved me an enormous amount of time and strain, though first year. Building up the comment library took a little bit of an effort curve. But now that it's here, I've found that it allows me to provide students with meaningful feedback much more quickly, even though there are a considerable number of them, and they need the feedback to come within days if they're going to be able to apply it to their next analysis. So that's been a lifesaver.
If I may show this, I think there was a question online. Bloom built the taxonomy to promote higher forms of thinking in education, such as analyzing and evaluating concepts, processes, procedures, and principles, rather than just memorizing facts. Sounds like you did just that.
That was the goal. That was the goal, and interested in not just giving students fun facts about mythology, not just giving students, here are the rudiments of tools that you use to analyze myths, to try and push them to the higher levels of taxonomy. Think about why you are using the tools that you are using. Think about just what it is you are getting out of it. That was an important part of the goal.
And you know, that's such a, I just love this because we've got so many faculty that are straining under the increased enrollments and saying, oh, how can I get to those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy? We all know that that's what we strive to do, but how can we do this with large classes? And it's kind of like you've cloned yourself a bit here, you know. And you can sit next to every student and give them expert feedback at the time that they want it, you know. And then you can come in with your comments and give them even more feedback, but even the expert stuff that just, you know, you pre-populated with, you know, you're giving everybody that sort of just-in-time learning.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, that was a very important part of the course when we first started envisioning it. Because I mean, it is probably not true that I'm the first person to teach this topic using technology ever, but I can tell you there would have been a very simple way to get this course online, and that would have been to make a sort of a very standard lecture and multiple choice based course where they had readings, they listened to my talking head, and they filled out multiple choice questions. And that would have been fine, I guess, but what is always important to me in all of my courses is to try, to the extent that it's possible, to move beyond the simple mastery of fact. Maybe some of that is that I'm in classical studies and our facts are useless. There's, you know, as I tell my students this every semester, is a week after this is over, you're going to forget who all of Zeus's children were and what he turned himself into in this story and that. And, you know, that's fine. No lives are going to depend on your knowledge of ancient mythology. What might actually be of use to them, and what I hope they will take away from it, is this sort of higher order thinking, is this ability to think, to read critically, to think deeply, to analyze, and to analyze their own analysis. They're never going to do this to myths again, probably. I mean, I can hope, but if they have learned something, and certainly I don't want to condemn all multiple choice ever, because we have multiple choice quizzes in the course. It is mastery of fact is an important part of learning about most anything. But if that's the hardest thing they're doing, then, well, I don't know. I would not feel right about that, at least for myself.
Kaja, can you comment on the use of tags? Like if you want to tag like certain assignments
right.
in the library?
I think first you have to give them a category. So let's say you call this, what is this, psychoanalysis?
Yeah.
So what category would you put this into?
Just sort of either psychoanalysis or module 3. That's what they're doing.
Module 3 is what you wanted?
Yeah.
Okay, and then now if I go back here and I go into the comment library and open library and filter by tag, and you have module 3, you have that one comment there. So tell me about the survey. What was how did you gather feedback, and what is the potential for further research and publication?
We also have to talk.
We haven't had that meeting.
Yes. Briefly, we typically, like ELO, typically sends out a survey, which is navigation survey. Now, two surveys, one in the beginning of the semester, one is around the end of the semester. We did that last time, and we have a short survey for the short courses. So last time we did that, we basically, at that point, we didn't intend to use it for any purpose, although we had in mind that we need to write something about this course, but nothing concrete. So we just had it for our own information, where we asked students how the design worked and how and we just had one question on ThinkSpace, basically asking them what kind of learning curve I think they had. That was one of the questions, and then whether blanking out right now. There were three specific questions that we asked about, and we had like a very mixed response. Almost 50-50 they said, okay, we didn't understand completely, like Dr. Hall pointed out, they didn't understand why we were using ThinkSpace, what was the connection to the course, and there were some students who really liked it. Like two opposite ends kind of a reaction. Then this time I said we should, so we had this mind that we need to do something with the course. So we got an IRD and I did a little bit of research, and there was a survey, the TAM survey, technology. I have the reference. So I took the questions from there, modified a bit to suit the ThinkSpace platform, and we had that survey out along with our usual navigation kind of survey. And the response rate was quite good. I think more than 60% of the students responded, which was really nice. Some few students gave extensive comments, like we have a whole paragraph of comments where we had an open-ended question. Some couples were quite nasty, but in general, I think they had very good feedback. Like things from it helps, like it helped me analyze the problem and then made it simpler. We had questions like, did it help you to help you as a learning tool, help you to do your work more efficiently, all of those kinds of questions. And I think we had quite a positive feedback.
Very positive. I mean,
yeah.
There was sort of some improvement, but still not sort of a total sort of night and day change between how well do you feel like ThinkSpace activities fit into the larger course. There's still some uncertainty about that, but specific questions about, did it make things easier? Did you, how easy was it to navigate? Did it help you with this? Did it help you with that? Those are overwhelmingly positive. So the students seemed to feel like it was doing good things for them, even if they didn't entirely understand why.
So hopefully we have to sit together and discuss how we want to use this data. But what I kind of have in mind roughly is like a two-part thing. One is just a reflection, because there's reflection on how the technology works in teaching a classical studies course is really valuable to write about. So one would be that aspect, right? And another would be the student aspect, how the students. So
things to talk about.
Yes, things to talk about, and then hopefully we'll get.
This comes under SOTO, doesn't it? Scholarship of Teaching and Learning.
This would be a great SOTO scholarship program.
And
yeah, of course you can. That's why we're talking
I might
about
get into things actually about my PRS and so forth, but
well, I mean,
a lecturer of us.
Well, lecturers, in order to become senior lecturers, usually have to do something extra. And often this is very much valued. We've got a lot of lecturers that do this, and they get promoted.
I would like to be promoted.
awesome.
I mean, you're sharing your success with the community, and when you're doing presentations like this, you could go out and share with your professional community at meetings. But if you can gather some data and analyze it, you set up an experimental protocol, and we can help you do that. That's the SOTO Scholars Program mentors you into that. And, you've already started some scholarship around the data gathering, but this could extend that.
Yeah, that could be really, really nice.
And this is critical thinking. This is different, you know. So it's a totally different layer, and I think this is really worth putting out there.
Well, I think there's so many people that are struggling with the same issue. You know, I mean, how do I get my students to think in the way of my discipline in a complex way? Yes, because it's something that, you know, it usually takes years and years and years, and, you know, how can we make it more efficient? And as our class sizes are becoming huge, and most people will say that's impossible, but I think you're doing it.
So I suppose that's really up to we'll have to ask the students if that's true. But
well, I mean, you're seeing good results as far as what they're producing.
That's true.
There's a suggestion here. It would be easy to change this case to analyze other passages and share them with your colleagues at other institutions and form a learning mythological community.
Nice.
That would have possibilities. I mean, one thing that one piece of this that might complicate that somewhat is that, and you can see this in textbook design especially, but so old-fashioned is the field of classics that there are some people who are opposed to interpretation as a part of the basic instruction of mythology. They say that no, teaching mythology needs to be about the content of the stories. Anything that you are coming in, any interpretive approach that you're coming in, is a modern imposition upon the ancient story. And that's obviously that's not my opinion, my considered opinion, because these stories have been interpreted from as soon as they were first told. But well, it could be a very rancorous community, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.